Hi, I'm Andi Locke Mears, and this is German New Medicine Made Easy. This is your one-stop shop for physical, mental, and behavioral answers. You can listen to this as a podcast, watch it as a video on YouTube, or read the direct transcription or the blog. And if you're not familiar with German New Medicine, definitely check out my very first episode called What is German New Medicine? Because this episode will make a lot more sense if you do. First, I want to say to those in the Black and Brown communities that my heart is with you. I know you carry an extra burden because our systems and policies disenfranchise you based on the color of your skin. Through no fault of your own, you will disproportionately experience systemic injustice and prejudice that can put us on completely different paths. For example, African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 32% of the U.S. population, and they comprise 56% of all incarcerated people in 2015. If African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates as whites, prison and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. The thing I want us to remember is that all humans are linked by our DNA. Genetically, we are all 99.5% identical. That means we differ by only 0.5%, which is half of 1%. Our biological processes are 100% identical, regardless of this 0.5% difference. What do I mean by our biological processes? It's our hardwiring. Dr. Hammer, over 35 years ago, proved that we are all identically hardwired for survival, all of us, no matter the color of our skin. In other words, we are more alike than we realize. It is time we stand up and not only remember this, but remind our neighbors of this and treat others knowing they are more like us than not. And we must dismantle the systems that say otherwise. That being said, the experience we have as humans because of the color of our skin affects us disproportionately, especially with our health. And this is what I want to discuss today. Let's look at how this disparity of experience affects the health of Black and Brown people versus white people from a GNM perspective. And a caveat here, none of this is blaming people of color. It is a call to action for all of us to do better, to be better, so everyone's health improves. I researched the top causes of death and filtered by race. The first thing that pops up is the disparity with heart disease. Heart disease has been one of our leading causes of death for all skin colors for many years, although it's declining, which is really good. And according to the American Heart Association, 33% more blacks than whites will die from heart disease. To discover why, from a GNM perspective, we need to first look at terminology. What modern medicine refers to as cardiovascular disease, when they say that, they are referring to the disease of the heart or the blood vessels. Dr. Hammer discovered these are each different biological programs, and not only that, but each part of the heart has its own individual biological program. GNM is very, very precise. There is a different program for the myocardium ventricles, the myocardium atria, for the endocardium and heart valves, for the pericardium, for the coronary arteries, for the coronary veins, for the aorta, carotid arteries, and subclavian arteries, and for the carotid sinus. This means we have 8 potential biological programs for what allopathic medicine calls heart disease or cardiovascular disease. When allopathic medicine mentions heart disease, they immediately follow it with what they call the risk factors, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, an unhealthy diet, lack of exercise, and excessive alcohol consumption. They say these are the reasons we have heart disease. Let me be clear. From a GNM perspective, these do not cause heart disease per se. High blood pressure, diabetes, and obesity are separate biological programs. An unhealthy diet, lack of exercise, and excessive alcohol consumption are what we would call contributing factors rather than risk factors. Risk factors supposedly increase the possibility of disease, while contributing factors more accurately say they have the potential to weaken the body, so we are more apt to have conflict shocks and healing phases will be more complicated. It's a very small but very important detail there. Let's look at each of these to see what all of these symptoms and, quote, risk factors have to do with heart disease, and statistically why more people of color have these symptoms and more heart disease than whites. Let's start with high blood pressure. The prevalence of high blood pressure in African Americans is the highest in the world. Not only is high blood pressure more severe in blacks than whites, it also develops earlier in life. Please remember this. We'll come back to this in a little bit. From a GNM view, there are 3 biological programs that have high blood pressure. These are the kidney parenchyma program, which is a water or fluid conflict, the myocardium heart ventricles, which is a biological program of feeling overwhelmed or having lots of negative stress, and the adrenal medulla program, which is unbearable and intense stress. Also, add to this that you can have high blood pressure in any conflict active phase and in any epicrisis. Even though high blood pressure has these 5 possible causes from a GNM perspective, the program that's best associated with what we would call traditional heart disease is the myocardium ventricle program, which I've already mentioned. It's an overwhelm conflict, a negative stress overload. There can be an irregular heartbeat and shortness of breath in the conflict active phase, along with high blood pressure, lung edema, peripheral edema, which means like swollen ankles, swollen legs. All of this is what they call heart failure, and it takes place in the conflict active phase with either a hanging conflict active phase or a hanging healing phase. The hanging phases can last for years, and the symptoms that occur with each become chronic conditions. The epicrisis for this program is a myocardial heart attack. And incidentally, anyone diagnosed with sleep apnea has many, many tiny myocardial heart attacks every night. This is different from the coronary artery program when there's angina in the conflict active phase and a coronary artery heart attack in the epicrisis. That's a different program. With the myocardium ventricle program, people are often conflict active or in a hanging healing for years. So what is diabetes? From a GNM view, this is a biological program that involves the alpha and beta islet cells of the pancreas. For males, it's a resistance conflict, so they resist something in their lives. And for women, it's a fear-disgust conflict. This means something that is scary and awful. Obesity. That's either a self-devaluation conflict, feeling less than, feeling inferior, or the kidney collecting tubule program, which is feeling abandoned, isolated, ostracized, or excluded. Obesity can also be both of those, a self-devaluation, feeling less than, and feeling abandoned or excluded. Next are the contributing factors that have a different effect on our bodies than what we have been led to believe, such as having an unhealthy diet. Does an unhealthy diet cause heart disease? No. Only a few specific biological programs lead to heart disease. You can live on junk food all your life and you never experience the symptoms of heart disease. However, if we eat predominantly food that is processed or filled with chemicals or GMOs or is denatured, it just doesn't supply our body with proper energy. And energy is what we need to make it through our healing phases. And thus our vital energy is weaker when we eat these. It just isn't healthy. That's common sense, right? We want to eat organic, whole foods as much as possible because these foods give us more vital energy. And when we have a conflict shock, our healing phases will be easier. They'll be less complicated. We also may experience less conflict shocks if our bodies are really strong and vital. Next is lack of exercise. What does exercise do from a GNM perspective? Well, it keeps our muscles, our tendons, our ligaments, and our connective tissue strong and pliable, keeps our organs in place. This keeps us stronger, and the stronger we are, the greater is our ability to make it through an expected healing phase without complications. Lastly, we have excessive alcohol. This is pretty self-explanatory, I hope. It's a substance that weakens us. It certainly weakens the liver. The weaker we are, the more susceptible we are to conflict shocks and more complicated healing phases. So how does all of this tie into the disproportionate number of deaths of people of color from heart disease? Inherent racism and implicit bias has existed in America since the first slave ship arrived here over 400 years ago, and it still exists in America today. Our country was built from it. Our country was built upon it. Our state and federal governments, our law enforcement, healthcare, social service systems, our schools and universities, our Fortune 500 companies, and even where grocery stores are located, all of this is set up with inherent racism and implicit bias. Here's the crux of this episode. People of color in America are more apt to experience biological conflict shocks of resistance and fear disgust, such as being passed over for promotions or being shot while jogging, or of losing friends to police violence. I would be resistant too. This is diabetes. People of color in America are more apt to feel inferior and less than, and also feel abandoned by the systems that are supposed to protect us. This sets people of color up for self-devaluation conflicts and kidney collecting tubule programs, which lead to the conflict shocks and biological programs that lead to obesity. Due to systemic biases against people of color, it's harder to find a good paying or livable wage job, and thus to make the money it takes to put healthy whole food on the table. Like I mentioned, living on denatured food weakens the body, which means healing phases will be more complicated. Many people of color lack the resources and the community structures that support exercise to keep their bodies strong. And then alcohol may be used as a way to cope. Because of these systemic, racially biased, and inequitable realities, people of color potentially experience the biological program of being overwhelmed, which is high blood pressure. Remember I said we'd come back to this. Well, here it is. People of color in America potentially experience the conflict shock of having a negative stress overload at a higher rate than whites and at an earlier age than whites, which means they start the myocardium program in greater numbers and at an earlier age. After years, decades even, of being stuck in either a hanging conflict, which is heart failure, or a hanging healing, which is also either heart failure or sleep apnea or a myocardium heart attack, their bodies weaken so much that they can't survive. This is why people of color die from heart disease at a higher rate. I am ashamed. The entire system developed by whites is meant to keep people of color marginalized, and that is obvious from the conflicts they experience. The body doesn't lie. Because of GNM, we know what begins every single disease, and the systems in America are definitely set up to favor some over others. To every white person listening to this and watching this, we must do better. 0.5% is not enough to divide us. Here is our call to action. My personal and professional goal is to create a world where everyone knows GNM, where children are brought up knowing from an early age when they are conflict active, and they are learning how to downgrade this themselves so their healing phases are minimal. Imagine if we had a world where everyone knew this information from a young age, no matter the color of their skin, so everyone could have more control over their lives and their health. We are already united in our DNA and in our hardwiring. Now it's time to create equity in our systems so everyone has the same choices and chances and knowledge. Black Lives Matter. Please join me in the work of recreating our systems so that everyone of all colors will be embraced. We know that less than 1% of our DNA is different. In the core of our being is the truth that we are all one. And I believe we are connected in ways that we're not even yet aware of. So please join me. Share this episode with someone who looks different than you. Preferably share this episode with someone who has a different skin tone than you do. Thank you. We can do this together.